Good evening, welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu. Shown behind me, the Mandapam, that is the G20 venue, and it's been a pretty remarkable day because despite a sense that it was not going to happen, India now does have, the world does now have a big agreement as far as G20 is concerned. It's called the New Delhi Declaration and it encompasses the views of the entire G20. There was a big concern that language as far as Ukraine would be a real problem, that language as far as Russia, Ukraine, that entire issue would not get thrashed out because of a hardline position taken by China and Russia on the one side and Western nations on the other. But astute diplomacy by India ensured that that was actually resolved. And it was resolved after 200 hours of negotiations which took place, and it got resolved, you know when? Last night. It's because of the resolution of this pressing issue, which has been one of the biggest problems in actually getting that G20 process to move forward, that we actually have this declaration which encompasses so much more. The African Union will now be a part of the G20. There'll be several other aspects of the G20 which we'll be talking about on this program as well. Also, a very special interview with the man of the moment, India's G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant. But first, let's bring you a couple of important details of a few major developments other than this point on Ukraine at G20 this time. There has been 100% consensus on the Delhi Declaration. That's why it's taken place. As far as Ukraine is concerned, India making it clear, the world making it clear, today's era must not be of war. The African Union has become a permanent member of the G20. That's been welcomed by African Union nations. India's DPI or Digital Payments Interface has been integrated into a financial inclusion plan which has been given to G20 nations. There is implementation planned of a 2030 agenda for sustainable development. This is so very important because with global warming and climate change, a reality we cannot deny, and with the world falling well behind its targets as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, these guidelines and goals are critical. More effective multilateral development banks and the promotion of equal and effective participation of women.
हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं।
A big bang announcement at the mega G20 summit. A consensus on Delhi Declaration announced by the Prime Minister. A big diplomatic breakthrough. A demonstration of India's leadership in the world today. A mega start of a mega meet. Bharat Mandapam all decked up to host the world's most powerful leaders. First to arrive, the Prime Minister himself. He received the guests with hugs and handshakes. Heads of states and chiefs of top global organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, the UN and the WHO all greeted by Prime Minister Modi in the backdrop of the majestic Konark Wheel. Prime Minister Modi took a moment to explain its significance to US President Joe Biden. Built in the 13th century, the 24-spoke wheel embodies India's ancient wisdom, advanced civilization and architectural excellence. The rotating motion of the Konark wheel symbolizes time and continuous change. It serves as a powerful symbol of the wheel of democracy that reflects the resilience of democratic ideals and commitment to progress in society. As Prime Minister Modi kicked off the summit, the first big announcement.
मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।
inclusion of 55-member African Union into the G20. India had pitched hard for African Union's inclusion, and the United States supported the proposal. G20 under India's presidency has seen the largest ever participation of the African countries. Another unmissable image from the opening was Prime Minister's nameplate that said Bharat instead of conventional India.
Well, joining us in a little while from now, we've got an entire panel with us. But before we actually get to that, let's go across to the special interview, the man of the moment, Amitabh Kant, what he told me in this exclusive interview a short while back. India's Sherpa at the G20, Amitabh Kant, joining us now. Thanks, Mr. Kant, very much for being with us. My first question to you, how did you manage to get several countries around the world to accept or understand the Ukraine-Russia issue?
Well, Vishnu, this was about close to 200 hours of non-stop negotiations. And, the Bali para had broken down. We were struggling with it for 9 months. So in the Sofa Talk meeting, we just took a plain screen and I scribbled down about 15 principles which we should follow. And then all the Sherpas joined in and gave their perspective on it, and all of them we took. Based on that, we did the first draft, and nobody expected this that we'll arrive at a consensus. Then on the first draft, we had a number of reactions. People were very pessimistic that we could ever arrive at a consensus on the Russia-Ukraine crisis because all multilateral, bilateral forums across the world have failed to arrive at a consensus during the last 1 year. Then from that first draft, we started with that comment. We went to the second draft, we went to the third draft. But I think after that, the bilateral meetings with each country, important thing was to draw the red lines of each country. We drew the red lines of each country, and then we worked on a draft, and then several rounds of negotiations, and with bilaterals with each Sherpa. But I think the important thing that really worked was that I was working in partnership with the Brazilian Sherpa, the South African Sherpa, and finally I got the Indonesian Sherpa together. So it became a joint proposal of 4 emerging markets. And then I roped in Mexico, I roped in Turkey, I roped in all the other Saudi. So all of them joined hands. And because there was so much of pressure from the emerging markets, because our concern was that for us, development, growth issues are far more important than the war issue. So finally, we then negotiated with G7 countries. We then negotiated with Russia. We then negotiated with China. And only last night, I think we gave them the final draft. We took it to the last minute, gave them the final draft. And at that Sherpa meeting, I've told them that this is the final draft, because I've discussed with you in over 200 bilaterals about 5 different drafts. This is the final document which we have produced, which is progressive, which is based on UN principles, UN charters. Either you take it or the deal drops. And I also told them that if anybody has an objection to this, your leader can go and talk to my leader, which is the Prime Minister. So I pulled the weight of the Prime Minister into this at that time. As the Sherpa, I pulled the weight of the Prime Minister. I said, I will not discuss anymore. I've done 200 rounds of discussion. And if your leader feels strongly about it, go and tell the Prime Minister of India. And my leader has given me the direction to do that. This is a perfect draft, and we've taken care of every country's concern, and it's very critical. We will not have a split para, we will not have a footnote, we'll only have a consensus. And that's how it worked, and today morning all countries fell in line and they all joined and collaborated with us. So that has been the driving force. But I'll tell you the story on another day at greater length, because I have to just zip for another meeting.
No, 1 second. I have another question to ask you, but you've also achieved something very important. You have ensured that Russian food exports will be promoted. In a sense, if the word Russia was included in the document, then Russia would not have signed on. But there's an incentive for Russia in this particular context, and it's a win-win for all sides. That's my interpretation. Is that correct?
The important thing to understand is that while we are not condemning or deploring anything, we are forcing everybody to go down to the UN principles, UN charters. And we are saying that territorial integrity, sovereignty, political independence, and territorial acquisition is non-doable. So we are pinning down everyone, not merely Russia. It's very important that we recall Bali, and then we pin down everybody on this.
All right, so Amitabh Kant speaking to me earlier on today. We'll be speaking a lot more to Mr. Kant to get many more of the real details because it would have been a fairly tense affair. Joining us now, Jayant Sinha, Richard Rosso, Ashok Malik, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee also with us, and Meera Shankar, the former ambassador of India to the US. Thank you all very much for being with us. Mr. Rosso, let me come to you first. Did you seriously expect this to go through without a footnote or without a split agreement?
I'm surprised, but I think once again, we understand that the fact that India maintains cordial relations with many countries, sometimes here in Washington, that kind of confounds us after Russia's invasion. But here's moments where you find it to be a superpower. India is able to bridge divides that most other countries aren't able to do. And I think the world's going to welcome the fact that we got something that was so concrete and forward-leaning. So congratulations, I think, on a job well done on a very tough set of negotiations.
How is it not interesting, Mr. Rosso, that the language used in the agreement actually meets the requirements of a country like the United States, which is leading the fight in a sense, along with Ukraine, against Russia? It meets your geopolitical requirements as well, but it also ensures that there is enough ground so that the basic issues of G20, and which is development, get addressed.
Well, I think if the United States administration had the pen on its own, there probably would have been language a little bit more biting and maybe pushing harder for direct sanctions, things like that. But I think, we'll continue to work those channels outside the G20 and be satisfied with the fact that, such a wide range of countries were able to come to some level of concrete agreement on language. So it meets maybe minimum standards, but we'll continue to work our interest through other forums, including direct support, of course, to Ukraine to hold off this aggressive act.
Yep. Ashok Malik, is this in a sense a coming of age of India as a diplomatic power? We are very much an economic power, the fifth largest in the world now, likely becoming third in a couple of years. But with that economic strength, is there a greater recognition of what Indian diplomacy can achieve?
There are 3 points here, Vishnu. One, to agree with Richard Rosso, the world has moved on since last year. The situation in Ukraine has also moved on. The war remains as intense. The conflict remains as poised in a sense. But I think Indian diplomacy achieved a lot in finding language everyone could agree with, in criticizing the change of territorial boundaries by warfare, in saying this is not a time for war, but in not mentioning Russia by name. So it ticked a lot of boxes. Having said that, we must also recognize that the West and the US, in particular the US administration, wanted this G20 summit to succeed. And in a sense, they've recognized that this is the minimum India could do. This is the minimum that could be achieved. There was no point holding out for a maximalist position. And India and the US have worked together to achieve this. Now, coming to India being a bridge between various actors in the global political sphere who can't otherwise work together, I think you got one wonderful snapshot of that when you had Prime Minister Modi sitting between President Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This G20 summit is important for the Delhi Declaration. Of course it is. I'm not discounting that at all. But quite honestly, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that's just been announced, is with support from the US, is potentially transformative. And I think both India and the US, and these are the two big actors here, recognized they didn't want to jeopardize these big announcements by disagreeing on language. Because the language would not have resolved the war in any case. The war will continue for many years to come.
Absolutely. It would have been a mess had that been the case. Yeah. Jen Sinha, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me, the inclusion of the African Union as part of the G20 process. Now that's wonderful for a billion plus in the continent of Africa, because it operates at so many levels. But I think it's also important because it makes India being synonymous with the global south.
You're absolutely right. This has been, in fact, a historic G20 presidency. And as all the previous speakers have also mentioned, India has played a very delicate, very important balancing role across many different factions that now exist in the G20, and being able to glue all of that together to come out with what I think everybody will recognize as being perhaps the most profound and far-reaching set of decisions that have been made in a G20 declaration. Of course, the inclusion of the African Union is one of them, but I also want to draw your attention to the steps that have been taken on sustainability and climate finance. I personally have done a lot of work in that area, starting with the Sustainable Finance Summit in Addis Ababa, and we have always struggled with this whole issue of how sustainability is going to be financed, particularly as far as climate is concerned, because the resources and the technologies are in the global north, and the requirement is most immediate and most urgent in the global south. So unless we forge the right agreements, unless we have the right institutions like the multilateral development banks primed and ready to provide that financial support for sustainability, we are going to be looking at some very, very perilous changes to our climate and to inclusive growth. So what has been accomplished in terms of multilateral development bank reform, the decision to triple their agenda, as the Honorable Finance Minister announced, to increase financing capacity by $200 billion, all in support of global public goods and sustainability, is also, I think, a landmark achievement for this G20 summit.
Yeah. Ambassador Mukherjee, let's talk about technological transformation and the digital public infrastructure we have in India. It's something which is available to the rest of the world because India is willing to share that. And it's not just the technology back end, it's also the experience. Again, how is this something or an area which works for India and might work well for the G20?
Well, for the first time, we put the issue of digital public infrastructure
Ambassador Mukherjee, go ahead. Yeah.
On the global agenda.
You wanted me to speak? Yeah. Well, I think that this dimension of digital technology and the application of digital technology for development has actually converged two processes. The first is what started in 2015 with the Digital India platforms and the constant references to how we were applying digital technologies for empowerment as well as for development in India. And when the Prime Minister addressed the 75th anniversary of the Economic and Social Council in 2020, I think that was one of the first multilateral platforms on which this story of India came into the multilateral domain and became a point of reference. And since 2020 till today, till the G20 summit declaration today, this has been a process of not only speaking of what we have done in India, but also sharing what we have done in India with other countries, especially of the global south, but also countries which are themselves industrialized countries. And the key calling cards in this have been the UPI, have been the transactions. Each G20 delegate has been given a digital wallet to test out what we are talking about. So we are walking the talk. We are also sharing our experience. And I think that that's something that is very important as far as empowering and getting the voice of India in multilateral diplomacy using technology for development is concerned. So this is a major outcome, as I see it, of the summit. And of course, there's an agreement among the G20 for developing principles and a framework. And that's very important because at the moment, there is a gap in the global architecture on how these technologies should be used for governance and for development. And while we are still far away from an international convention.
And that's a gap that needs to be understood and filled.
Yeah.
I take that point. I just wanted to keep the strike rotating. I'm running short on time. Ambassador Meera Shankar, it's interesting that India also managed to work with China, and it has to be said, China, contrary to what many thought, did not play the role of spoiler this time around. They actually went around with all of the agreements because they are a key part of G20. They've accepted the G20 text, which was given by India, and so they want a spoiler. And you know, it's a positive sign. It's a positive signal.
Yes, I think the India's ability to bridge the divide between the Western world on the one side and Russia and China on the other, I think has been a significant aspect of this G20. As far as China is concerned, I think once Russia came on board, I think China would have not wanted to be isolated and be the spoiler. We've seen this in the past also, that China quite often does not want to be the single country opposing. And as I said, once Russia came on board, China was basically supporting the Russian position, so they also supported the consensus. The other significant aspect is the coming together of developing and developed countries. So these are the two divides which India has helped to bridge, because you have a very substantive agenda in this G20 of the developing world. I think one of the significant things is how to accelerate funding for both the Sustainable Development Goals and climate finance. And in this process, you need reformed multilateral lending institutions, which are bigger, better, and more effective, as the finance minister said. The endorsement of revised capital adequacy norms recommended by the independent expert group would release $200 billion additional dollars of funding for the World Bank. But also the question remains of how they can leverage capital markets to again augment the capital which is available for development. On climate, there was very substantive movement with agreement to reduce greenhouse gases by 43% by 2030 and a doubling of capital finance, of climate finance for the adaptation process to climate change. So again, a significant...
And there are lots of key points over there which we need to get into as well. Absolutely. Very, very significant. Ambassador, I'm interrupting you now because I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. I need to take a short break for two reasons. A, it started to pour where I'm sitting outside, and B, because I've got a lot more coming up in the next few moments.
G20 presidency has walked the talk, and getting consensus on Delhi Declaration was challenging. But how does geopolitics explain this? All of this has been explained, but to talk in detail about this, we have Senior Minister Hardeep Puri with us. Sir, you've been a diplomat for many years of your life, and you've always been optimistic about this declaration coming out. So tell us, what made you optimistic? Why aren't you surprised?
No, because look, the central theme on which the Prime Minister predicated India's G20 presidency, that became increasingly clear. He was talking about a human-centric development, human-centric approach to development, post-COVID, and the establishment of a new international order. Now, clearly, if you look at the history prior to this, the world has seen many crises. The G20 was born in the moment of a crisis in 2006 when the world financial and economic crisis took place. We are facing another crisis or multiple crises today. And the Prime Minister's approach was eminently suitable to navigate through all the, divergences, the contentious eras. And I had no doubt, knowing a little more about Indian diplomacy than most people do, that at the end of the day, we will produce not only a declaration which will be remembered for its substantive content, but that substantive content also has to be viewed in terms of the splendor of the, 60 cities hosting 200, 220 meetings, the cultural extravaganza on display, etc. But if you look at it from the point of view of what it says on climate finance, on digital infrastructure, on other issues, health, etc., this is a declaration which will be remembered for the fact that it incrementally builds on all these sectors, the 6 priority areas for India, but has produced something much more. I mean, you finally brought, under India's presidency, the G20 onto the African Union onto the G20 table, and in a side event, you produced the Global Biofuels Alliance, which I personally, you forgive me, I'm the line minister, I think it's going to be one of the more tangible things to talk about for the years to come, both for our biofuels, for our development. We're already on the process of making 20% biofuels by the 2025, but also in our transition to net zero.
Your most significant takeaway from the G20 Leaders Summit in New Delhi?
Well, I think the fact that there was a declaration and that declaration got everyone together, and I also think it really has improved India's standing in the world.
हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं।
Today, as I look back at the 10 months of Indian presidency, I am left with gratitude and satisfaction. I can confidently state that the Indian G20 presidency has walked the talk. India, as you all are aware, through the India Stack, became the first country to develop all 3 foundational DPIs. So DPI has also been integrated into the G20 Financial Inclusion Action Plan, the FIAP, which will run between 2024 and 2026. That's a strong legacy of the Indian presidency.
This has laid the foundation for very bold action, but more than anything else, it has amplified the voice of Global South. It has also demonstrated that India has a huge capacity of bringing the world together and leading the world in developmental and geopolitical issues as well.
With regard to the to the comparison with the Bali Declaration, I would only say Bali was Bali and New Delhi is New Delhi. I mean, Bali was a year ago, the context, the situation was different. Many things have happened since then.
Well, one of India's oldest partners and closest friends is South Africa. And this is a very special G20 for several African nations, not least of all South Africa, with the formal inclusion of the African Union as part of the G20. Joining us now to talk a little bit about that, Vincent Magwenya. He is the spokesperson of the President of South Africa. President Ramaphosa must be delighted at this. What were his first thoughts or your first thoughts?
No, indeed, the President is delighted. As you will know, this is a position that South Africa and President Ramaphosa in particular has been advocating for quite some time, that you cannot have more than 1.4 billion people excluded from such an important premier platform for international economic cooperation. It is also thanks to India as the host, which from the onset in its presidency of the G20 championed inclusivity, championed the stronger voice for smaller countries and developing economic countries. And so thanks go largely to India. But we are certainly delighted and we see this as a very meaningful step going forward in terms of the various challenges that the world has to tackle with respect to climate change, with respect to security, that now Africa is going to be included in the deliberations of the G20 going forward.
Yeah. You know, we've had BRICS in South Africa recently and now G20 over here. Has there been this constant process of communication between India and South Africa on this very big goal of getting the African Union into the G20? It's been a bit of a process, hasn't it?
Indeed, indeed. The two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Ramaphosa, have had several calls in the build-up to the BRICS summit, discussing the shape and format of the summit. In light of the dynamics that we had to manage with respect to the President of Russia, but also discussing India's overall theme for the G20, what India sought to achieve with the summit, as well as the inclusion of the AU. So there has been that constant communication and full cooperation between the two countries.
Mr. Magwenya, tell us a little bit about what inclusion means, because to me inclusion is a word that comes with so many aspects. There's the entire issue of women's inclusion and empowerment, which is a core theme in South Africa as it is in our country. There's financial inclusion as well. So when we're talking about inclusion of the African Union, how would the African Union want a bigger say and a bigger stake?
Well, inclusion means a number of things to us as South Africa, but also more broadly as a continent. It includes representativity in key forums that, let's call it key global governance forums, key forums that look at developmental finance. It includes the reform of multilateral institutions, may it be the United Nations Security Council, the international development finance institutions. So it's not just representativity, but there has to be an ongoing process of reform that takes place, that takes into account the different dynamics that you find globally, particularly the challenges that are facing your smaller developing economic countries with respect to how they're impacted by climate change as well as other challenges that they face.
Let's talk about climate change. Who needs to pay for climate change tech? It's expensive, but the solutions are available, and it's been a constant financing concern.
Well, the developed world has benefited for many years, if not decades or a century, over the emissions that have impacted our environment. And therefore, it's only fair that the developed world takes a far greater responsibility to assist developing economic countries on funding the climate change goals, but also on funding the transition into decarbonization. And so our view is that whilst you may have funding that comes in the form of loans, that funding has to be upweighted more in terms of grant, coupled alongside whatever form of loans that are given. But we feel that the developed world has had more than 100 years of building its economies at the back of very, very strong and damaging carbon emissions. And now it's time to clean up, and that responsibility should be largely burdened by developed markets.
You know, India's got a big and strong digitalization network. For example, I have an app called DigiLocker on my phone, and it's got everything. It's got my driving license over there. It's got my car registration numbers. It's got my COVID vaccination status, the fact that I've got a second vaccination as well, all of that and a lot more. And it's a digital backbone. It seems to have helped our economy a lot. There's been a big World Bank report which came out just yesterday. Do you believe this is technology which can be modified and used by South Africa?
Well, not only just technology, the entire approach that India has adopted with respect to technology, whether it's pharmaceuticals, research and development, or it's such integrated platforms of service, there's a lot that South Africa can learn and emulate from India. A large part of our cooperation or bilateral cooperation between South Africa and India centers around transfer of knowledge and skills in the digital ecosystem. And so South Africa can certainly benefit from learning from the advances that India has made in this regard.
You mentioned pharma. India's had a role during the COVID period when we started the process of disseminating vaccines to countries around the world, and I believe South Africa as well. Do you believe that that is a huge link? That India, with its ability to manufacture drugs at low expenses and large quantities, plays a big role in providing this resource to several countries around the world and certainly in Africa?
One of the top two areas of Indian investments into South Africa involves the automotive industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry. If you look at issues of pandemic preparedness, for example, if you look at issues of fighting various diseases, there's a great deal of cooperation that is already in place between India and South Africa. And that cooperation can only grow.
I must also ask you one or two more questions. The first one is this. Beyond just G20, what are some of the key areas that South Africa is looking for in terms of building on the relationship with India?
Well, we are looking at consolidating the position of the Global South, consolidating the Global South as an increasingly influential bloc that has space to express itself in various multilateral forums. We are looking at obviously growing the relationship at a bilateral level. At the BRICS summit, as you know, additional members were accepted as of January next year. And we will be looking to India in providing leadership, just as it has done with this beautiful and well-organized summit, in consolidating the BRICS club of countries with the new members on board. And taking BRICS forward.
Right.
There is an expectation that additional members will be included during the Russia-hosted summit next year. And again, India will play a very critical role in harmonizing that transition of the BRICS club of countries and taking that grouping forward.
And one final question. I can't let a South African get away without a question on cricket. Do you seriously think South Africa is going to beat India in cricket in the World Cup?
Yes, of course. Why not?
Who is your favorite South African cricketer?
Our captain, Themba Bavuma.
Right. And are you a bigger rugby fan or a bigger cricket fan?
I'm actually a football fan, but right now we're defending our Rugby World Cup title in France. And so our focus is on that one. Once we've successfully defended our title in France, the Rugby World Cup, then our focus will be on securing for the first time the Cricket World Cup trophy.
Fantastic team. Some of my favorite cricketers have been South African. Dale Steyn, my favorite fast bowler, and so many others. But thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking to you. It has been a landmark G20, certainly for the entire process of inclusion of the voices of billions around the world, the Global South and the African Union, which is such an important partner for India. Let's see how far this goes and how progress is actually quantifiable.